their works of art now.
That's fine.
So throughout the book, there are works of art, photographs, and so on. And there is a photograph where we have Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez in Havana, and they're horsing around with students, and the students tied the two of them together with a medallion. And in effect, it became sort of symbolic of what they wanted to do, which was to have both revolutions succeed, which they thought that they would, or fail to. So that was also important in our justification of how to choose Cuba and Venezuela, because they intended to be each other's partner economically, and socially, and to help each other succeed or fail. So I wanted to say a word about the very beautiful cover of the book. The book, as you can see, has a photograph on it. It's a painting, which today is in my house in Michigan, but it came from an artist here in Miami, who was a very well-known Cuban artist, Aldo Menendez, and his wife Yvonne did a couple of paintings that are collages actually on Cuban history and Venezuelan history that are inside of the book. But this particular photo is so beautiful, I think, because it has so many symbolic things in it. Okay. And Aldo knew me very well. I mean, we were very close friends. And Yvonne said that whenever we got together, she had to leave and go somewhere else because we were going to talk about Cuba for the next 3 hours. And so we knew each other very well. And I never said to him, I want you to do this. He did it because he understood what immigration meant to him. Okay. And what it means is you see a boat so that there are some emigres that are getting ready to leave, but it's deep at night. They don't know where they're going. They don't know what's going to happen to them there. They don't know what their future will be like. It's very uncertain. Although there are some glimmers of the beginning of a new dawn, I hope. And it's surrounded by candles lit, like the way that when you go to a church, you light a candle, like a promise, like a hope, like a prayer for a better future. And at the same time, you see that inside of the boat, there are old tiles. And that was very typical in Cuba, where people don't have rugs, they have tile. Very often they came from Italy or from Spain in years past, and they last forever. They're very beautiful. And Aldo meant it as a symbol of what the immigrants take with them when they go, is they take their culture, they take their past, they take their history, they take what means a great deal to them. And that's what the tiles are doing there. So it is very, very symbolic. And unfortunately, Aldo died before the book came out. But he knew it was going to be the cover of the book. And just about a few days ago, when I communicated with Yvonne, who will be at Books on Books tonight, and their son, and Yvonne said it was so moving to me to see Aldo's painting on the cover of the book. Indeed, the whole book is illustrated with photographs, works of art. I worked hard with my university, who gave me, it was called the Publication Subvention Award, enough money that I could pay for really good photographs from Getty, from Reuters. They cost like $350 a piece. But I also, a couple of times, I am the photographer there because, of course, I spent a lot of time in Cuba over the years. With some of my trips were shared with Jorge over the years, trying to understand what had happened in that land and what were the causes and the consequences. Because Jorge is going to focus his presentation on the latest waves of immigration from Cuba, I thought that I would then, instead of going all the way back to the beginning of the revolution, although I'm happy to do so if you want, but I thought I would concentrate my comments on what has happened in Cuba most recently. Okay. And I think that anybody that is a Cuba observer has noticed a couple of things. Okay, one is that the economic crisis in Cuba is so profound right now that it is the word crisis. We need like another word, with which to try to explain how something that has been a crisis for such a long time can continue dipping and getting worse and worse. And we still have only one word, crisis. But for example, Carmelo Mesalago, who is an excellent professor, an economist, does a lot of really good work on the economic trends that have taken place over time. And he's not going back to the 1960s. He's not going back to the beginning of the revolution. He's going back usually to 1989. to the moment when communism falls in the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries. And then you can still begin to see a remarkable decline in Cuban society, which can also no longer be attributed to the embargo, because the embargo has been, in some ways, a constant for all those years. But in fact, also because beginning with the case of Elian Gonzalez, and many of you were here at that time, and Balcerito, the youngest Balcerito ever, as he is now called, in fact, the United States began to loosen up the embargo as a result. And Cuba now imports food, very often chickens from North Carolina, turkeys from Michigan, and medicines from the United States. And the United States has actually become Cuba's 5th largest trading partner. So whatever was happening was not due to the embargo that not only was in some ways a constant, but had in fact been loosened up. And things from that point of view had gotten better and not worse. Okay. The other is that the political crisis in Cuba has become very acute in recent years. Okay. For all the years when Fidel Castro was there and he was still lucid, oh, Carmelo is here. Carmelo, I just mentioned you. Oh, qué bueno, qué bueno.
You mentioned it.
Yeah, you mentioned it. No, it was 2:00. 2:00. Well, don't worry about it. But I did just mention that you were an excellent economist and that you were tracing the economic trends in Cuba, particularly since from 1989 on, and that I rely on work in this regard to try to show one, the continuously deepening crisis in Cuba, and also that it's not just an economic crisis, it's a political crisis. Okay, so where does the political crisis come from? Well, the political crisis, I think, comes from the fact that the Castro brothers are no longer there. And in particular, not Fidel. Fidel had what sociologists call a charismatic leader. The word charisma goes back to the Greek, which means the gift of grace. And he did indeed have the gift of talking to people and for them and about them and connecting to them back and forth. Many, many, many moons ago, when I first started going back to Cuba, about 20 years after my parents left, and it was possible for the first time after the dialogue between the Cuban government and the Cuban exile community, it began to be possible to return. And at that time, I used to see people in Cuba glued to the television whenever Fidel Castro would speak for hours and hours and hours, and these little televisions that people would just sit there and watch and watch. And, you know, he had that gift of grace, you know. And then, of course, Fidel kept getting older and also sicker in many ways. And Raúl, at some point in there, sort of progressively took over the helm of the government, where he had always been behind it with the military, being the head of the military, but then progressively he stepped forward and forward. And Raúl didn't have at all that gift of grace. Everybody knows that he's not a charismatic person. His speeches were dull, uninteresting. People didn't really want to sit through it, but he was a reformer. And reformers are also government leaders that sometimes can have people be thankful for the reforms that they have initiated. So when the one and the other were there, a lot of people were behind them still in Cuba, though of course we know that people were also progressively leaving and leaving all the time. But the situation has really changed most recently because Fidel died, Raúl got old enough that he doesn't really want to be at the helm, although he's always behind the government. And so Raúl chose somebody, you know, as they say in Mexico, by el pedazo, you know, it was his choice. And this person that he chose, Miguel Díaz-Canel, really has no communication with the people in Cuba. People don't look up to him, they don't admire him, they're not connected to him in any way. And so there is a real political vacuum in Cuban society at the same time that the social and economic conditions have become worse and worse. So what we have seen, one of the results of that is, and Jorge is going to talk about it, so I'm not going to talk about it, although it's usually something that I care very deeply about, an exodus, and particularly an exodus of very young people. Okay. I have to say that I regret the fact I used to, you know, my first place, my family divided politically with the Cuban Revolution between those who rejected it and hated it from day one, my father. And then those who aspired to creating a better world through that revolution, my uncle. And on both sides of my family, the split was very profound, and it's been there always and always. So I always had a family in Cuba that were descendants of my uncle, who I had loved very much when I was a child, but he was a true believer in communism. He had studied medicine at the Sorbonne in France, and when he came back to Cuba, he came back as a member of the Communist Party of France, right? Okay. And I think he kept his beliefs no matter what was happening in Cuba. He was a doctor, he believed firmly in public health, and he went all over the world speaking so well about the Cuban Revolution and what they had done in public health, representing Cuba everywhere. Okay. And I think he kept his beliefs until the 1994 crisis of the Venezuela. And at that point in time, when he saw the people who were leaving, that were poor people, that were working class people, the people for whom he thought the revolution had stood, I think he got off the boat at that point in time. But he had very little, only a few months more to live, and he was ill most of the time. However, his family was always there. And I went back every year and a half, every 2 years to be with them, to continue being family, to help them as much as I could, even though there were times when I was not able to do much of anything, being in graduate school and so on. And now, in the last year and a half, all the young family that I had in Cuba, the ones who were 33 years old or so, had just gotten married, they have all left here. I won't go into it with any more depth then because it belongs to Jorge, but it's sad for me, that I no longer have the family there that I once had, that I no longer have a deep tie to that island that I have never stopped loving. And I think the very fact that very young Cubans who were born during the revolution, that went to school in schools where they, with the little red bandana tied to their necks, they were taught to say that I want to be, when I grow up, I want to be like a Che. Okay. And they have all left and left because they don't see any future. And I think that that's very tragic. And along with that, I think that the other major difference that has taken place recently is that although Cuba has had a dissident movement that I happen to admire, because there are people who have stayed through thick and thin with their beliefs and suffered a great deal for them. And that has been true from the mid-1980s on. It has, taken different names at different moments in time. I think it was probably at its largest and clearest under the leadership of Osvaldo Paya. And we all know Osvaldo Paya died, and the accident doesn't seem to anybody like much of an accident. So we know what happens to people when they become a popular alternative in Cuba. And so that has been there all the time. And yet I think that there is now another moment of dissidence in Cuba in which it has become popular. It has become something that people are constantly now going out on the streets, constantly taking a frying pan and hitting the frying pan to make sure that the message that we don't accept the fact that we have nothing to eat because all of you who are in government eat very well. And that has become something that people now do a lot in Cuba, that they protest very regularly. They're also oppressed very regularly. And we know that, after the July 2021 protests were very massive, and over 1,300 or so, some people dedicate themselves to counting them. People went to jail, and still there's something like 700 people in jail or so. Okay, so, but still there is a new dissidence that is not just that of people who were able to stand up for their beliefs through thick and thin, but it's becoming a popular form of expressing oneself. At the same time that we have this massive exodus that is taking place. So I think that these things are different in Cuba. And I would say that I don't need to tell anybody in Miami about Patria Vida, because here it's a little sticker that you see everywhere, Patria Vida, Patria. But I admire a lot what the musicians did. I interviewed one of them when I was here Christmas before last in Miami, in Funky. And he told me at the time that there were 3 of them in Cuba, and the others were here, the United States or Spain. And they knew, the ones in Cuba knew that they would be the ones to pay for Patria in effect. And in fact, Seguridad del Estado accompanied him to the plane. As he got on the plane to leave for the United States, they said to him, "Don't come back." And he didn't say anything, but he said afterwards to me, "I wasn't planning on returning anyway." And his other two very dear friends are, still in Cuba as Amnesty of International people in Cuban prisons. I admire the fact that they were able to craft an independent idea, so that people couldn't say, "Oh, this is the American influence, this is the influence of the Cuban exiles in Miami," and so on. It came from the Cuban people. It was their idea. They said, "We like to play dominoes. You have in your hand the ficha, the tile that says 59. We have in our hand the ficha, the tile that says 22, because they thought 2022 would be the year of enormous change in Cuba." I think that is something that they brought to the fore out of Cuban culture, so that nobody could say this is the result of imperialism or this is the result of this, that, and the other. It came out of the popular culture in Cuba, and I admire that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Is he there? Brian, can you hear us? Brian Fonseca,
Brian,
are you there?
No,
you have to step up. So I'll go. So thank you, Sylvia, for your presentation. As I said before, I wasn't going to be a panelist here, but Dr. Garnier could not make it. So I prepared this short presentation, hopefully, on this very specific topic that Sylvia Pedraza and Carlos Romero deal with in their book, which is the impact of revolutions in Cuba and Venezuela on massive exodus. I'm going to focus on the Cuban exodus and particularly on the most recent wave, which began roughly, I think, in the last decade. Okay, here we go. Now, I have a little disagreement with Sylvia. It's a friendly disagreement in terms of the number of waves. In the book, we talk about 6 waves, 5 waves, but I think now we're entering a new wave. And of course, this is something that we're witnessing right now, but it's not really a very significant difference. But here are roughly the 6 waves as I see it. The first 5, everyone agrees on them who studies Cuban migration. So just quickly, I'm not going to go into any details, but the first wave in the 3 years after the revolution, you have the estimates of how many people came to the United States. Then the freedom flights, 65 to 73, the huge Mariel exodus in 1980, the Bastero crisis. And this is where I think we have to think about what has happened lately since the beginning of the so-called wet food, dry food policy, which I assume most of you are familiar with. The policy that President Clinton implemented, in which he distinguished between those Cubans who were caught at sea and were sent back to Cuba. They were the wet ones. And then the Cubans who made it to U.S. soil were allowed to stay. And under the Cuban Adjustment Act, became permanent residents a year and 1 day afterwards. The wet food, dry food policy was canceled by President Obama in January of 2017. And this is, I think, where now it looks like it's going to be a different wave of Cuban migrants, which the last, so it's the last 5 years roughly, and of course it continues as we speak. These are the official numbers that you can download from the Homeland Security Department. Clearly it's an undercount because, as I'll show you in the next slide, there are a tremendous number of people, about 225,000 people who were detained across the border from Mexico. And we don't know, according to these numbers, they haven't been admitted as permanent residents. They might be under parole. They might be waiting for deportation orders. We don't know that yet. And as I say, this is a sort of a stage in flux. And but I do think that when Obama took that decision, something happened to Cuban migration, and this is part of what happened. So these are it's another source of information, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, that you can also look up online. So beginning in 2020, very few Cubans actually were encountered, I think the euphemism, were being detained by the U.S. Border Patrol. But notice what happened in 2022, which is again, that 225,000 people who were detained. That is the single largest number in a single year ever for Cuban migrants, both before and after the revolution. So that's why we're talking about a qualitatively and quantitatively different kind of migration. Now, as you may know, especially if you live in Miami, the wave has receded somewhat since last October, especially after January, when President Biden took a number of measures, including deporting those who had no authorization to cross the border, and also allowing some Cubans to be sponsored, and as well as entering through different sorts of paroles. So in fact, that migration, it continues to this day, but has dropped tremendously compared to the last year. So one of the reasons then I think that why we can talk about a new wave of migrants is precisely because of the surge, the sheer number of people who are desperately coming from Cuba. And as Sylvia just sketched for you, the pressures, economic, political, and health pressures for so many, especially young people, to come here in whatever way they can. I already mentioned the 2017 wet foot, dry foot policy elimination, which I think inaugurates a different kind of stage of Cuban migration. Another thing that has happened in the last 3 years, I just quickly mentioned that, is that even though most Cubans are now coming in by land, there has been also a pattern since the Balsero crisis in 1994, ups and downs, reaching a first peak in 2015, then declining after the end of wet foot, dry foot policy. But just last fiscal year, more than 6,000 Cubans were detained at sea by the U.S. Coast Guard, and the fiscal year hasn't even ended. So we should expect this year, again, a significant increase in the number of Cubans who are trying to come by sea. So combining with the major flow of people across the land border from Mexico, we have definitely a crisis. It's one of those recurring crises in Cuban history, particularly in the case of Cuba to the U.S., beginning with Camarioca in 1965, Mariel in 1980, the Balsero crisis in 1994. It looks like every 5 to 10 years, there's a major migration crisis. And of course, these crises respond very much to economic and political pressure on the island, as well as U.S.-Cuba relations. The other major factor I think that has to be taken into account is under the Trump administration, 2017, 2020, there were several drastic measures taken by the White House, among them those that the president himself came to sign here. I don't think they get along with each other too much right now. The vice president, President Trump, the dean of the law school, and the former dean of the law school, also was forced to resign. Yes. Anyway, so Trump comes to Havana several times. It wasn't just one, but several times to make these very stringent, take these very stringent measures to the delight of much of the Cuban American community. But I think that has to be taken into account in order to understand the kinds of pressures that were increasing in Cuba, and that frankly made life miserable, not necessarily to the Cuban government, but to much of the Cuban population. And then, as Carmelo himself has documented very well, it's the worst economic crisis that Cuba is living, at least since the special period in the 1990s. 2020, the economy plunged by 11% and hasn't really recovered, although officially the growth has taken place again. But the kinds of scarcities, the lack of food, the lack of medicine, the lack of gas, and almost everything that you need, the long lines that also were piling up even during the worst moment of the pandemic. And of course, that complicated with the rapid spread of the disease, even though in the beginning it looked like Cuba might have been spared some of the issues, it did not. it was not spared. And Cuba actually had a comparatively bad record compared to other Latin American countries in terms of the spread of the virus. Along with that, like many other countries in the world, Cuba decided to close its international borders because of the pandemic. But this, of course, had a tremendous negative impact on the tourism industry, which is the mainstay of the Cuban economy, and particularly the decrease in the number of Canadian tourists. There was a time in which Russian tourists were becoming more numerous than any other, as well as Cuban Americans who were traveling to Cuba before the pandemic in very large numbers, and during these 2 or 3 years practically stopped. And then, of course, came what already Sylvia mentioned, which is that extraordinary moment, the July 11 protest in 2021, that I don't think anyone really had predicted, either here or there. We're taken by surprise, the kind of spontaneous, massive expression of discontent throughout the island, not only in Havana, but also in other parts of the island. Thousands of people participating in them, young people, older people, blacks, whites, men, women, etc. I think we're still trying to understand why that took place and what are the consequences of that protest. Of course, it wasn't a single that moment by itself. There were many others, the Cacerolazos, for example, that Sylvia also mentioned, and many other smaller protests throughout the last year and a half. And as well as the extreme measures that were taken by the Cuban revolutionary state, the number of people who were detained, arrested, sentenced to very long years in jail. And clearly the Cuban government was not going to allow this to be repeated. And in fact, in November of 2021, a second attempt to create a peaceful manifestation was not able to be to take place because of the Cuban government's repression. So all of this, I think, has to be taken into account. And again, it's a combination of political, economic, and health motivations. My final set of my final 2 slides actually are who is actually coming, because we know that there are more people coming. More people are risking their lives coming through the Straits of Florida, but also across the border to Mexico. But who are they? It looks like from a gender perspective, roughly half of them are women, the other half are men. We also know from anecdotal evidence and also from the statistics, these are official statistics from the Homeland Security Agency, that they're young, that they are between the ages of 18 to 44. That's not very surprising. Accordingly, most of them are single, so they're coming on their own, not in families. This actually, I had to look several times to make sure that I was understanding what was going on here. About a fourth of them only. I would actually emphasize that it's a very small percentage. Especially, I didn't have the time to talk about the earlier wave, but we know that the first waves of Cuban migrants tended to be highly representative of the middle and upper sectors of Cuban society. But here, we're actually talking about a smaller percentage. I'll show you the comparative data in a moment. A smaller percentage of people who are more educated and more skilled. You know, if you want to talk about classes in Cuba, that's another topic altogether. But clearly, they don't represent the more privileged sectors of the island society. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of them intended to reside here in Florida, particularly in Miami. And this is actually something that I was surprised too, because officially speaking, the vast majority of them are classified as refugees or asylees. And from everything that I know about the contemporary Cuban migration, in fact, most people who are coming in are not technically considered refugees because they have to prove a well-founded fear of persecution, which of course, for somebody who's coming in across the border with no documents, etc., is very hard to prove. So actually, most of them, and this is the last item that I want to mention, most of them adjust their status and become permanent residents after a year and 1 day, again, under the Cuban Adjustment Act. So this gives you a sense of what kinds of people are coming. To me, it appears that it's a very wide cross-section of Cuban society. almost everyone is trying to leave the island. It doesn't really discriminate. We don't know, unfortunately, how many of them are white and black according to the data, but we do know that the majority are white, like they have been since 1959. Now, a final point is, if you compare the available data, and again, I'm using the official Citizenship and Immigration Service profile data. I'll plot that here. It's, well, this is a Cuban population based on the census of 2012. And I don't know, Carmelo, you'll be able to access the more recent census. I haven't. I tried in the last three days. And they say that the website for the office of the ONE, the statistics office, is not working. So I had to rely on the latest census in Cuba, which was 1220. So that'll do for the moment. So this is a breakdown by general occupational categories. And then when you compare that to those who have been admitted in 2021, the latest year that I could get, I think a pattern emerges from that data. First of all, as I said before, the percentage of people who are professional and managerial, the upper sectors of the occupational structure, are underrepresented. There are actually many more, about a third of the labor force in Cuba that are classified as professional and managerial. And conversely, the percentage of people among Cuban immigrants who come from the lower, less skilled sectors of the labor force. And this is, of course, I'm lumping here together a very large number of different categories like transportation workers and factory workers, et cetera. But you see that the percentage of Cuban immigrants in this category is actually higher than the Cuban population. Service workers is roughly the same, but if you add them up, the two lowest categories, lowest occupational categories, you have a majority. So again, this is some evidence that the current migration flow from Cuba is drawing primarily on the working class and the poorer sectors of the population and not on the upper. This would be something to look at because sales and office are overrepresented among the immigrants compared to those who live in Cuba today. I don't really have a good explanation for that. So to conclude, I think we are in the presence of a new reality, a new stage of the Cuban migration process that has been going on for 6 decades. And that compared to previous immigrant waves, especially the first two waves in the 60s and 70s, this is a qualitatively and quantitatively different form of population displacement. And that we need to understand better the motivations of this wave, and also, of course, the consequences, which we actually don't know that much. How many of them are coming to Miami? What are they doing here? How do they incorporate into the labor force, educational challenges, and so on. So I guess there's going to be a lot of work to be done on this topic in the future. So thank you very much. Hope that we can get Ryan Fonseca. Yeah, Ryan, your turn now.
All right, thank you so much. Right on cue. First and foremost, thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of this discussion. And please forgive the fact that I'm not there in person. I would have much rather been with you in person to engage in such an important and fruitful discussion. So of course, shout out to all the key players here. It's great to have Sylvia in town, and the contributions that her and Carlos have made in this new text, I think is really important. And so I thought I would focus my talk, or at least my comments, on 4 themes that Jorge asked me to address, and maybe some opening comments. And so hopefully my thoughts will be a little bit provocative and more importantly, help shape a fruitful conversation after formal presentations. Now, I will say I might be a little provocative and then have to run afterwards. Unfortunately, General Counsel for TikTok is in the room right next door, and I got to rejoin the session that I'm out here participating in San Francisco. But nonetheless, I want to focus my talk on 4 themes. First, I'd like to talk about the socioeconomic and political context that gave rise to Hugo Chavez in the late 90s, and how he sort of framed his Bolivarian revolution as he made his way into power in Venezuela. Second, I'd like to present a few key themes from Chavez's time in power up until his death in 2013, and talk a little bit about some of maybe the prevailing considerations that I think really kind of frame his time in power. Third, I'll talk briefly about the current situation with Maduro at the helm. And then finally, in the spirit of Sylvia and Carlos's work, I'd like to toss out at least a few considerations that I think really differentiate the Cuban and Venezuelan military institutions engaged, to and throughout the revolutions in Cuba and Venezuela. So first, Chavez's rise. I think there are at least four important considerations that contribute to Chavez's rise and sort of his building of the brand of Bolivarian revolution. First is the economic context. Of course, and there are far more prolific economists in the room that can certainly go into the details on this. But I think in the 80s and 90s, Venezuela began to adopt a set of neoliberal economic policies, which attempted to reduce state control and increase the role of private sector in the economy. I think these policies were seen as by the time the revolution sort of propped up, seen as benefiting the wealthy few at the expense of the poor and working classes. And I think you saw sort of expansion of economic inequality across the country. In the 90s, Venezuela was in the midst of a dire economic crisis that I think led to, again, high levels of poverty and unemployment and inflation. Traditional political parties and sort of political elite were unable to address these issues effectively. And I think that led to a widespread dissatisfaction with government and the loss of faith in many sort of undermining supportive democratic systems, or at least maybe not sort of democracy in general, but just the support that it had that democracy was going to solve its problems. There was an increasing dissatisfaction with the system at play. And I think Chavez was able to capitalize on this dissatisfaction by offering a message that seemed to resonate, a message of hope and promise to address, at least some of the economic and socioeconomic problems facing Venezuela, and largely advocating to do so through what he sort of proposes as a socialist agenda. I think another key aspect is sort of the widespread political corruption that was seemingly pervasive before Chavez took the helm. At least certainly the elevated perception of that. Venezuela had a history of corruption in its political system, with many political elite and government officials engaging in corrupt practices. And we could say that's not very different than it is today, where there is, incredible widespread corruption across the system today. But I think that was also true in the public consciousness at the time. And I think this further undermined trust in government and dissatisfaction with sort of the democratic system, ultimately, again, shaping a context that provided space for, someone like Hugo Chavez to rise. Now, I think, and Celia pointed this out at the onset, I think, there are a few things that were very specific to Chavez that also enabled him to take advantage of sort of the social and the political, the economic context that was going on at the time. And one that Sylvia mentioned is charismatic personalities of these leaders, right? Chavez was known for his charismatic personality and his ability to connect with the Venezuelan people. He was able to mobilize a grassroots movement that was based on, really his personal appeal and a message that he tried to carry forward of social justice. His speeches were often filled with populist rhetoric and anti-imperialist sentiment, and that seemed to resonate with many Venezuelans who felt marginalized by the political and economic elite at the time. And sort of in addition to that, I think another really important element of Chavez's background was his military background. Many of you know this and probably know it far more in depth than I do. But Chavez was a former military officer who had attempted a failed coup in 1992. And although he was jailed for his actions, he gained popular support for his efforts to challenge the corrupt political establishment, at least that seemed to be dominant in the political consciousness, of many in the state. And after his release from prison, he was able to leverage his military background to appeal to a broad range of Venezuelans who were, dissatisfied with the status quo. And so overall, I think Chavez's rise to power was the result of these complex and perhaps others, set of social, economic, and political factors that combined to create an opportunity in which Chavez's background, his sort of his charismatic personality and sort of the flag that he planted as a revolutionary, I think he was able to sort of take advantage of the context and thrive. And so, Hugo Chavez elected in 1999, I think that's really what marks the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution. And I'll talk about that in a moment of sort of how I interpreted the Bolivarian Revolution, particularly based on some field work I did, in which I had the opportunity to be hosted for several research trips to Venezuela by Aníbal Romero in Venezuela back in the day, right? And so many of you that have studied sort of political sciences or the politics of Venezuela remember Aníbal as a major contributor. But nonetheless, I mean, I think that sort of the 98, 99 marks the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, and I think becomes a really significant turning point in the political evolution of the country, and one that I don't think is, we're going to be able to sort of go back from anytime soon. Chavez's presidency was marked by controversy and, again, a seemingly deep, pernicious polarization. Today, pernicious polarization continues, and is characterized largely by a us versus them political environment. Chavez's supporters hailed him as a hero, while his critics accused him of, centralizing power, authoritarianism, and awful mismanagement of the economy. His policies and rhetoric often divide Venezuelans along ideological lines, and I think set the stage for the political crisis that would engulf the country and that remains, deeply seated in the country today. So I want to touch on 5 aspects of Chavez's presidency and Bolivarian Revolution I think are important. The first is, and again, and I say these in the context of sort of the rise, the onset of the Bolivarian Revolution. So first is, that Chavez, often advocated and sought to disrupt the existing political system. Chavez campaigned on a platform of challenging the existing political system and the political elite in Venezuela, which he characterized as corrupt and unresponsive to the needs of the people. And by people, I think he was largely sort of talking to, those that he would advocate for in his grassroots efforts to build a constituency that ultimately was highly supportive of him, I think right up until the end, and remained supportive. And I think that's a fissure in Venezuela today. Those that remain supportive of sort of the Chavez era, and those that seem to be moving forward with Maduro. Nonetheless, he promised to introduce a new constitution that would decentralize power and give more voice to the marginalized sectors of society. But I tend to see that he did the opposite. During the early years of his presidency, he slowly purged major institutions. 3 institutions I would highlight are the judiciary, the military, and of course, in an effort to wrestle the economy, PDVSA, right, and sort of the oil sector. And a lot of my work on Venezuela has been focused on the military and the culture of the military institution. I'm happy to field any questions about the institution later on. But I think those are 3 institutions that he purged noticeably in an effort to, centralize and gain influence over, over Venezuela. And I, the 2 I'll sort of just expanded, thought on. One, the intent of purging the military was really a product of, survival of Chavez's government. Much of the purging really began to escalate after Chavez was removed from office briefly in 2002. And I think you saw at that point some, pivots in terms of how the Bolivarian Revolution evolved after that. The purging of PDVSA and the walkout of 25,000, executives and managerial personnel and others. I think those 2 institutions were vital. Chavez saw that, the means of funding, the kinds of reforms that he wanted to do would only be possible by, again, co-opting the main economic instrument of the state, which was the oil sector. And that's something I think he did fairly successful, at least at a time in which oil prices were, kind of going through the roof, and he was able to fund a lot of the social programs that he wanted. And in fact, if you sort of on that, transforming the existing political system, I think his 2007 referendum also sought to continue concentration of power into the executive branch. And additional purging that would, was designed to coup-proof his government and I think ensure survival. Second, Chavez embraced and promoted a combination of socialist, populist, and sort of nationalist principles, right? And I think this aggregated into, you know, the ideological foundation of the Bolivarian Revolution. Chavez founded the Bolivarian Revolution on socialist principles, where he advocated for more equitable, you know, distribution of wealth throughout society, and increased social programs. Involved nationalizing key industries such as the oil sector, electricity, as I referenced, and using revenues to fund social programs. The Bolivarian Revolution was also characterized by a strong populist rhetoric, which aimed to mobilize the masses against the elite. This included a focus on social justice, anti-imperialism, and anti-capitalism. The Bolivarian Revolution was also founded on a strong sense of nationalism, which was rooted in the legacy of Venezuelan independence hero Simón Bolívar. The movement aimed to create a more sovereign and independent Venezuela, free from foreign influence. And it's interesting. So I think about, you know, kind of the ideological foundation of the Bolivarian Revolution. I remember it was in 2007. I was in Venezuela observing, you know, the process of the referendum, and I was at Universidad Central, and I came across a poster, and the poster essentially was a pro-government poster, and it was essentially a marketing piece for what it called the Bolivarian Marxist Leninist Revolution. It seemed to fuse all of these things together to characterize a Bolivarian revolution. So it was like all those three were kind of pitched on this marketing poster on the walls at Universidad Central as a means of kind of promoting, you know, some wildly, you know, multifaceted, you know, Bolivarian ideology. So nonetheless, I think that, you know, combination of socialist, populist, and nationalist principles were sort of framed to, you know, characterize what many sort of classify an you know, tough to define, you know, Chavismo in sort of contemporary period. I think, you know, a few other things. Third, I think Chavez vocally advocated for social justice. I mean, this is something that he kept, you know, arguing was at the foundation of the Bolivarian Revolution. You know, he you know, vocally committed to promoting social justice in Venezuela and addressing, you know, and at least vocally, you know, sought to address the country's high levels of poverty and inequality. He did introduce a wide range of social programs, including subsidized food and housing, healthcare and education, and then cash transfers to poor families in an effort to try to, you know, draw equity in the balance sheet between perhaps the old political elite and middle classes and sort of the poor. You know, I think fourth, Chavez worked to centralize the economy. He was also committed to, like I mentioned a few times, nationalizing key industries in Venezuela, which had been dominated by foreign companies. Fifth, I think in probably the area that I focus most on is the way Chavez disrupted Venezuela's foreign policy orientation. I think this is really key in terms of at least how I've looked at the Bolivarian Revolution. I mean, Chavez was a strong advocate for regional integration and pursued a foreign policy that challenged, sort of U.S. leadership, what he would argue is U.S. hegemony in Latin America. He tended to form alliances with other left-leaning governments in the region, including Cuba, Bolivia, and others, and promoted the creation of regional organizations such as ALBA and UNASUR. I think among the most important, it was already pointed out several times, was Chavez's relationship with Castro's Cuba. Chavez and Cuba first met in 1994 following Chavez's release from prison after the failed 92 coup that attempted to oust Carlos Andres Perez. But in his visit to Cuba, Chavez gave an impassioned speech at the University of Havana in which he praised Cuba as a stronghold of Latin American dignity that must be emulated. However, I don't think the relationship really took form until Chavez's election to the Venezuelan presidency. And I think for Castro, Chavez appeared to be one of the last, possible champions of the Cuban-inspired revolutionary movements that were sweeping across, the Americas in much of the latter half of the last century. Chavez identified, and I think to Fidel's, pleasure, it sort of identifies a socialist and often employed this highly charged anti-imperialist and anti-American rhetoric. He viewed himself as a revolutionary, keeping with the precedent set not just by Simón Bolívar, but Fidel Castro, and would often, to at least articulate publicly. Castro attended Chavez's inauguration in 1999, and later that year, the two governments began to establish vital economic, political, and security ties. The two leaders visited each other frequently between 99 and Chavez's death in 2013. And Chavez was especially fond of making these unscheduled stopovers in Havana. In fact, I recall him celebrating, Castro's 75th 75th birthday in Venezuela. And so again, I had an opportunity to write on the Cuba-Venezuelan relationship with a colleague, John Polga Hasimovich, who's at the Naval Academy, and we wrote a piece called the Ties That Bind, essentially looking at the security relationship between Venezuela and Cuba that's evolved over the last few decades. So I think that one of the most important, or at least visible, relationships in the foreign policy space was the expanding of the relationship with Cuba. Chavez also deepened relationships with other extra-hemispheric powers, particularly U.S. rivals such as Russia and Iran. And this is something that, again, signing major contracts with Russia in the form of multi-billion-dollar arms contracts, and those seem to be very prevailing today. In fact, a lot of the arguments about Russian influence in the Venezuelan military today is a product of the arms deals that took place in 2006, and sort of the legacy of those arms deals of keeping the Russians committed to playing a role in the Venezuelan military, despite some anecdotal stories of departures between Russian and Venezuelan military members that that really did not seem to hit it off well in terms of the ability to work together. And again, I mentioned Iran too, a deepening of relationships with Iran. And in fact, I was in Argentina, I think it was 2008 or 2009, and I was asked on TV, I was doing an interview with Perfil, and I was asked if whether or not I thought that, Chavez would introduce or at least broker relations between Iran and Argentina. And, I was, understanding the context in Argentina, I said, well, I think Chavez is promoting Iran, across the region, and trying to broker relationships between, Iranian President Ahmadinejad and Chavez's allies across the region. And again, I said this in Argentina, knowing that, the history of Iran, Argentina, and the bombings that took place in 94, 96. And so I said against that backdrop, and I remember it was one of the most humbling experiences, because within the first hour of it airing, there were 1,000 comments, and I think 999 of those comments called me a complete, buffoon, and out of touch with the history of Argentina, and as a young, aspiring intellectual, that was crushing on my spirit. But it turns out years later that there was a brokering of relations between Iran and Argentina that Chavez, helped forge. And that was one of the things about Chavez's foreign policy, is he took on, sort of he sort of pushed Venezuela towards a very activist foreign policy. I mean, historically, in the region, Mexico, Cuba were activist foreign policies. In Chavez's period, it seemed that Chavez, with Venezuela and certainly Brazil, became sort of the activist foreign policy, or activist foreign powers in the region over the last, at least during the first part of this century. Nonetheless, I think that, from a foreign policy perspective, the last thing I'd say there is that, Chavez also certainly increased his tensions with the United States. And I think a lot of that tension, at least visibly and perhaps more assertively, came after after the attempted 2002 ousting of Chavez, in which so many blame the United States for that. The last thing I would sort of cover on sort of Chavez's time is again the egregious human rights violations that I think you can certainly evidence that the Chavez regime was responsible for. And I think during Chavez's presidency, lots of human rights violations reported, not just by local, but international human rights organizations. And so you had a series of things like suppression of political opposition, and the use of excessive force to sort of repress, anti-government, or at least opposing, political, social, even ideological beliefs. There was a deep restriction of media freedoms during the Chavez administration, where he imposed restrictions on the media, including, famed sort of closer of opposition media outlets and the harassment of journalists and other critics of the government. And I think that it created sort of a self-censorship for many in Venezuela that, opted to self-censor as opposed to, face the potential, wrath of the government at the time. And I think there was also a lack of judicial independence, and you can sort of capture that in the essence of human rights violations. The judiciary in Venezuela was was criticized for the lack of independence and impartiality. Lots of reports of political interference in the appointment of judges and the prosecution of cases, leading, I think, to an undermining of trust in the judicial system. And I think these rights are, these human rights violations are well documented by local and international human rights organizations. And while some of these violations were also reported by, some of these violations continue during the Maduro regime, and I'll talk about that next, because I think that kind of leads me into the next thing I wanted to touch on. And again, I'll try to wrap up here soon.
2 minutes, Brad.
Oh, 2 minutes. Well, then let me go to the thing I wanted to add comparatively, which is thoughts on the differences between Cuba and the Venezuelan military in the context of revolution. So I'll just outline a few things here. First, I think the militaries had very different roles in the revolution. In Cuba, the military played a central role in the success of the revolution. So in other words, the contemporary Cuban military was born out of revolution. The inverse is true for Venezuela, in which the Venezuelan military was purged in the aftermath of the revolution, attempting to tie the military institution to the survival of the regimes. I think the militaries at the onset of revolution had very different ideological orientations. Again, the Cuban military was very much aligned with the Marxist-Leninist ideology and remained, a product of revolution. In contrast, the Venezuelan military has a more varied ideological orientation, and I think that's been purged over time. But still, I still think there are fissures within the ideological preferences of those in power today. The militaries have had very different roles in the international community. The Cuban military has been very much involved in international military missions, including famed missions in Africa and Latin America, and has also played important roles in training in other countries. And in contrast, the Venezuelan military has been very insular. In fact, the Venezuelan military hasn't fought in interstate conflict since independence, and therefore it's preferred an internal mission as opposed to an external security mission. And I think there are, finally, just some important differences in terms of civilian integration, in terms of the role that senior military leaders play in the Cuban government versus the role that senior military leaders in Venezuela play in the government. There's probably some similarities and contrasts that we can make there. And so that's probably, I've warmed up my welcome, and so I'm going to stop talking at this point, and I hope that my comments were semi-coherent and provocative for discussion.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, first of all, for the invitation to be here with a stellar panel talking about such an important topic, and the presentation of this book, which is very timely and hopefully the first of many systematic efforts to compare the two political experiences. Here to focus on a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is my home country, Venezuela, though Brian already did a very good job at summarizing the political dynamics under Chavez. I think I'm going to focus a bit more on Maduro. I am a human rights lawyer, so I'm going to try to focus on the human rights violations in the country. But bear with me, I only have 15 minutes, so I'm going to have to cram a lot of information into this time. So I was going to talk a little bit about the context that led the country to the state in which it is now. And I agree here, I'm going to borrow Professor Pedraza's statement about the word crisis not being enough. We need another word for what is going on currently in Venezuela. So I was going to go over our democratic breakdown, but I'm going to do so very briefly now because I think, it's been covered. As many of you know, we had our original democratic transition in '58 with the pact known as Pacto de Punto Fijo. The democratic leaders that up until that point were opposing the Marcos Pérez Jiménez dictatorship came together and agreed to establish this consociational democracy in which they would prevent any single party hegemony. So in 58, we started our democratic experiment, which would go on for 40 years up until 1998. Brian mentioned some of the systemic ills of those 40 years, which were very pervasive, and they showed their face, especially as of the oil bust of the 80s. I would add something to what he said about our political dynamics and about the main features that led to Chavez's rise to power. And I would add the fact that since we are a petro state, all of our political dynamics have always been very closely tied to the ebbs and flows of the oil price. So in the 80s, we see that this system that up until that point, with many ills, pervasive corruption, political patronage, disenfranchisement of many sectors of the population, we see that the pillars of this system start to erode, and we start to see social unrest. We see that economic growth, which seemed to be unstoppable up until that point, comes to a halt. We see that the civil control over the military is certainly harmed when Chavez leads that failed coup in 1992, and the military sort of breaks into the political arena again after going back to the barracks in 1958. And in the year of 89, as many countries in the world were taking their steps towards democracy in that miraculous year, the Venezuelan system of punto fijismo was actually starting to erode very visibly. So those key pillars of modernization, of economic growth, that civil society that emerged during punto fijismo that was very vibrant, very dynamic, those start to somewhat crumble. And the 90s see a country that dives into an economic crisis. Polarization is underway. There's a lot of social unrest. In 89, we see these very famous riots, especially in Caracas, and the political leadership that is at the helm of Punto Fijo is unable to placate these social demands. So anti-establishment dispositions and attitudes become very generalized. And I agree, Chavez was able to capitalize on that discontent and fuse it into a political project. So Chavez effectively had that gift of grace. He was a very charismatic leader indeed. So when he led the coup in 1992, he failed, he was imprisoned, but he became a household name. And people, even, the most prominent representatives of Venezuelan intellectual elite, somewhat applauded him for stepping in and for trying to do something to steer the country in a different direction. So even though he had attempted to topple a democratically elected government, people respected the fact that he was able to lead this coup in 92, even though he failed and was in prison. So when he was pardoned some years later, he ran for presidency and he won by a landslide in 1998, promising to rebuild the Venezuelan state from the ground up, and basically with an anti-punto fijista demand, starting anew, creating a new constitution, and making sure that the inauguration of the Fifth Republic would erase those systemic ills that people resented so much in Punto Fijo. So he comes into power, he fuses together two movements or two forces that were excluded from Punto Fijo, the military for one, but also the left. So he's a military and leftist political project that comes into power and that starts to change the Venezuelan political system, both within the borders, but also Venezuela standing in the international order, as Brian correctly mentioned. So there's a new constitution in 1999. We see the democratic breakdown. Many scholars point to 2002 when he was ousted from power and then quickly came back. That's the point or the date to which many scholars point to as a breakdown of democracy, the start of a hybrid regime, which had some democratic features, some autocratic ones. Competition for power was still real, but it was unfair, political patronage, populist policies. Chavez enjoyed record high oil prices, which allowed him to navigate the disastrous consequences of his economic policies, including nationalization of many companies, persistent attacks against the private sector, foreign exchange controls, price controls, among others. So since I'm going to try to focus on human rights, it is worth noting that under Chavez, civil and political rights started to erode as well. He engaged in persecution of perceived opponents. He packed the Supreme Court from 20 justices, taking it up to 32 and filling it with people who were loyal to him. As of that point, the constitutional process to appoint judges and prosecutors was just left out of effect, and over 80% of judges in the country now, but since the moment are temporary, so they were appointed and removed with no respect of the formal process for designation. So obviously, judiciary is penetrated by this new ideology, and the functionaries that work within the judiciary are subjected to enormous pressures and threats of removal. So with a judiciary that was co-opted, these abuses of human rights were unfortunately left without much consequence, and they still are now. So we had a centralization of political power, the closing of media that was critical of his governing policies, an increased role of the military in internal affairs, and protests met violence under Chavez as well. People sometimes tend to think that there was a big rupture between Chavez and Maduro, but there is really no way to understand the current human rights crisis and humanitarian crisis under Maduro without first understanding them as a consequence of the political project that is Chavismo. So protests against Chavez were met with violence, and there were some reforms that were discreetly introduced to allow preventive detention. And so the violations of human rights certainly were clear under Chavez. In fact, in 2012, he denounced the American Convention on Human Rights and left the system when the Inter-American Court of Human Rights issued a new judgment declaring the international responsibility of the Venezuelan state. Up to that point, there were more than a dozen judgments citing the responsibilities of the Venezuelan state for human rights violations. So Chavez decided to leave that system, denounced the convention, and in 2013, that court lost jurisdiction over Venezuela. So we had that democratic breakdown, that erosion of democracy and rule of law under Chavez, which continued and became more severe, more grave under Maduro. So with Maduro, we see harsher crackdowns on opposition. We see that these human rights violations start to become a part of a systematic, widespread course of conduct, which has been pointed to by many international bodies. And today I'm going to talk about one of them in particular. So we see also the closing of channels for political dissent. We see the Supreme Court in 2014 interpreting the right to protest or for peaceful assembly, saying that people needed to require a permission from authorities to be able to engage in protests. We see, of course, the election of the National Assembly in 2015, in which the opposition won 2/3 of the seats and then was basically hand-tied by a Supreme Court that was partial to Maduro and substituted by a constitutional assembly created by the government that did not even produce a constitution. It just took on the de facto powers of the National Assembly. So we see that democracy breaks down definitively under Maduro, and many practitioners and experts point to 2014 as the year in which the Venezuelan political system becomes a full-fledged autocracy. And that is a year as well in which we start to see these patterns of human rights violations that have been described time and time again by human rights organizations, both at the local and international levels. In the case of Maduro, he does not enjoy the oil boom that Chavez did. So those consequences of those economic policies introduced by Chavez become quite evident under Maduro. In 2017, the country enters a cycle of hyperinflation with an estimate of over 2,000% in that year. It is still now the highest in the world. We see massive shortages of basic products. There is this complex humanitarian crisis and economic breakdown with the collapse of many public services, including healthcare, including education. We have economic conditions that have been unseen outside of war or a natural catastrophe. And the oil industry was basically run down to the ground, with certain points of, of variation, but since it was emptied of its professional staff and filled with loyalists, the PDVSA just became an empty shell of what it used to be. So we see soaring numbers of infant mortality, diseases that were previously eradicated, like diphtheria and measles, coming back with a vengeance. We see majority of the population with food insecurity, skyrocketing figures of hunger. And although there has been some economic growth in the last couple of months because of this somewhat forced dollarization, the humanitarian crisis continues to drive citizens out of the border, and Venezuela's exodus has become the largest the region has ever registered, with over 7 million people having left the country since 2015, which represents roughly 1/5 of the population. So as I mentioned, in this context, there is an overall lack of access to economic and social rights. But in terms of civil and political rights, repression became a state policy in 2014, especially as of a nationwide cycle of protests that started in the month of February. The United Nations Human Rights Council created the International Independent Fact-Finding Mission on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela in 2019. And this is a body composed of 3 experts that have dedicated themselves to studying the patterns of human rights violations in the country as of 2014. So they have found that there are 4 crimes that are repeated consistently across the years, and they are repeated with specific purpose. So those include extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detainments, torture, and other cruel and inhumane and degrading treatments, and enforced disappearance. So the reports that this fact-finding mission has issued, 3 to date, they offer chilling details and evidence of the practices of security bodies and of intelligence services that work for the state, the ways in which they use these systematic practices to deter political dissent, to punish opposition leaders and even people just trying to participate in citizen protests when there is lack of water, lack of gas, lack of electricity, and also to try to boost popularity whenever election cycles come around and they want to reduce the rates of crimes. So in the first report, the fact-finding mission found that in the case of political dissent, the state uses these forms of crimes to engage in arbitrary arrests without due cause. Venezuelan legislation provides that you can only be arrested for 1 of 2 reasons: if there is an arrest warrant against you, or if you're committing a crime at the moment, which is called in flagrante delicto. So the mission found that Venezuelan authorities were detaining people in spite of the fact that none of these 2 conditions are met. They take them to safe houses or to headquarters of intelligence security services where they are tortured and held incommunicado, with state agents saying to lawyers and families that they do not have the person in custody, that they don't know about their whereabouts, which amounts to an enforced disappearance. Venezuelan law states also that if you are detained, you have to be presented before a court of law within 48 hours of your detention. So there are altered detention records that change the date of the detention to meet that lapse, but people are arbitrarily held in these safe houses, in these clandestine places all over the country, where they are subjected to torture, beatings, asphyxiation, electric shocks, extreme temperatures. I mean, you name it, it's in there in the report. And then people are presented to a judiciary that is absolutely complicit in the commission of these crimes. I had the privilege of working in a university in Caracas, and a group of professors. We taught law at a university when this cycle of protests erupted in 2014, and many of our own students were detained in the context of those protests. So in the case of two of the students, when they showed up to the hearing in court, they were visibly disfigured. And when the hearing came about, one of them said in the stand that agents from the Bolivarian Guard had kicked him in the face and produced the wounds. And when he said that, the judge pointed at the secretary in the court and asked her to stop typing. She immediately stopped typing. And the judge answered, "I don't know what you're talking about. You look like a perfectly healthy young man to me." So these patterns that are detailed in the fact-finding mission report, you could see them at play when the judiciary itself is involved in the commission of these crimes and accepting altered records of detention and not opening investigations, despite being requested to, not opening investigations into these arbitrary detentions. These reports also detail the security operations that are carried out in order to combat crime, in which people perceived as criminals are executed in low-income neighborhoods, especially in Caracas, but in other cities as well, where security forces barge in looking for a person that they perceive to be a criminal without, regardless of whether the person actually has a conviction or an arrest warrant, and clearing out witnesses from the area and just executing the victim, simulating confrontations, despite the fact that witnesses say this person was held or immobilized when we left. So these patterns are all detailed here, as well as the horrific massacres that are occurring in the Orinoco mining arc. Obviously, because of the situation of the oil industry, which cannot keep up with the capacity that it once had, the regime has had to turn to other funds of sourcing, including drug trafficking and illicit activities, but also the exploitation of the country's mineral deposits. So in the Orinoco mining arc, there are not only agents of the military, but also armed groups that are operating and sustaining control of some of these deposits. Many, of course, confrontation among these armed groups have led to the displacement of thousands of people and to the massacre of a lot of the miners and civilian populations in the area. There's also detailed reports of human trafficking in the area, of forced prostitution, of child labor, and other types of crimes that are repeated consistently. So the importance of these reports issued by the fact-finding mission, and again, I'm just picking one out of a group of reports and statements by different international bodies pointing to the human rights situation in Venezuela. The importance here is that they describe the pattern. They describe the fact that these are not isolated events or excesses committed by individual members of the state security forces. They follow a distinct course of action. They are methodical. They are committed by following orders from top officials. And in fact, these reports tie senior regime officials, including Maduro himself and Diosdado Cabello, to the commission of these crimes. They not only provide the resources for it, they provide the orders for it, and the state, of course, is unwilling to investigate with any degree of seriousness these abuses that are being committed against the civilian population. So crimes against humanity, as defined under international law, require the commission of a series of acts as part of a widespread and systematic attack against the civilian population, which is what the mission considers is happening in Venezuela. To finish, I will say that the International Criminal Court also opened an investigation into the case of Venezuela for allegations of crimes against humanity committed in the country since 2017. The prosecutor, Karim Khan, had originally reached an agreement with the Maduro regime, stating that the Venezuelan state was going to push these investigations forward and that it would administer justice for these human rights violations. But enough time went by without any meaningful action that the prosecutor decided to resume the investigations and has asked the pre-trial chamber for authorization to do so, which was obviously criticized by the Venezuelan government. But it also serves to illustrate how these crimes effectively follow a pattern that is being investigated by many international bodies. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to my fellow panelists, and if you're still here with us, Friday afternoon at 3:30, maybe you're interested, and probably have questions or comments, so we open the floor.
Yeah, first of all, congratulations, very interesting presentations. I have learned a lot. I have a question. When you presented the characteristics of the embassy, didn't remember what it was, 2021 or 2022. I think it's 2021, right? You
The last
have,
slide?
yeah, right.
Yeah, I was using two different sources. Sources describing the Cuban migration year, 2021, that's the latest that we have. And then I had to compare it to 2012, the census of 2012.
Okay. Now, the emphasis of your presentation that was impressive here was on human rights. You very briefly mentioned the impact of the decline of the oil price, but also maybe 1 minute. And I think this is a very important. As an economist and an expert on social policy, I have a couple of comments. There is an annual survey that is conducted by the University Andrés Bello, and it's a very reliable source. They have been known for many years, and they show the tremendous economic and social deterioration in Venezuela. For instance, in terms of poverty, they have been following poverty for many years, and poverty have increased tremendously. A data, by the way, that we don't have in Cuba because they never publish data on poverty. Second issue is that wages, real wages adjusted for inflation, have declined dramatically. There have also recent public demonstration in which public employees were claiming that these salaries, they didn't cover practically even the most essential food needs. You refer to the issue of food security. Mm-hmm. And then the situation with pension is even worse. The pension adjusted for inflation in Venezuela not even covers 1 week of food. And I think it's important to stress these points because it's not only as Michelle Bachelet reported in the United Nations. He stressed that it was not only an issue of human rights, but it was an issue of humanitarian crisis and very detailed went into this issue. So that's what I wanted to point out.
Thank you for that. Yes, I agree. I did not underline the economic part too much because I wanted to from the information and focus on human rights.
Effect, of course, of the decline in the oil price, but it's an effect
of course
of the economic system.
Of course, I agree. And yes, I think there is no way of understanding the current economic crisis without understanding Chavismo as a political project and Chavismo's economic policies, which began under Chavez, to be sure. The economy in Venezuela between 2014 and 2021 contracted at an 80%. So yes, it is the breakdown, absolute breakdown of a country that had once the resources to modernize. It had this influx of money through the oil industry. And these sources that we're talking about in that report by the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello, which I agree is very important, they're all substitutions for official figures which have not been published for years. Some people report some recovery in the last few months due to the fact that the government eased the control on the foreign exchange prohibition. But it had to, and it has to be said, it had to loosen up those controls because of the collapse of the economic grid, of the electric grid in 2019, in which the country went completely blackout and people had to resort to dollars to pay because Bolivar was worthless. So because of that loosening up in controls, there has been a slight increase reported, but I agree with you and I thank you for highlighting that. These are the results of a project and not only of oil prices. So yeah, I think that is a very important thing to highlight, and the government has had good sources of advice as to how to redirect the economy. It just hasn't wanted.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions?
Why, this is a question for the panel as a whole. Why was such charisma, Fidel and Chavez, followed by like a total lack of charisma?
Yeah.
You know, you know, Maduro and Diaz-Canel.
Yeah.
What happened?
Oh, well, if you want my, I think, you're right. I mean, that is a complete charisma followed by a complete lack of charisma. But I think if you look closely at the Cuban Revolution, you will see that Fidel was always very good at getting rid of his competition. That from the beginning, the Camilo Cienfuegos disappearance, the disappearance of El Che, you know, and so I don't think he minded the complete lack of charisma of the people who followed him. So, you know, by the way, let me say, because I'm the one that brought the word charisma into the discussion, and you know, it's still good. But that I just want to say that now political sociologists more and more are thinking in terms of populism. Because at the root of a populist regime, you have the charismatic figure. But the advantage of thinking about it in terms of populism is that there's populism of the left, like Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez, and there's also populism of the right, you know, such as Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro and Marine Le Pen. And so it's become a broader concern of people that are trying to identify why is it that human beings are bought and sold by charismatic populist figures throughout history. It's sad, but it's true.
Let me see,
I-
Brian
No,
wants to-
I just wanted to add, I thought that was excellent. I would also add that, you know, you have to combine some tremendous emotional intelligence with charisma to be able to sweep, you know, the hearts and minds of majorities in these respective countries. And so I think it wasn't just the possession of charismas, it was the ability to operationalize charisma, right, towards achieving political goals, that I think is really important. And I would suggest that that is not sort of plentiful in societies in which you have not just someone who can navigate a room, but someone who can operationalize that towards political objectives in the way that, you know, that Fidel and Hugo Chavez did. And so the default personality is those that are in power today. The exceptions are the truly charismatic individuals that can operationalize that behavior or that charisma, you know, in ways that, you know, can take countries. So I would say it's charisma plus an ability to operationalize. And then, of course, the common personality trait is not that of highly sophisticated, charismatic political figures, right?
Thank you.
Well, my name is Carlos Rodriguez. I am a Venezuelan from a family is Cuban, actually. I was born and raised in Venezuela, and I wanted to know the panel if looking at the experience and how the relationship between the diasporas and Cuban Venezuelans is very different, for example, to the Cuban and Colombians or the Haitians. Do you think that there's a special relationship or a Cubanization, for lack of a better word, between the Venezuelan diasporas and the Cuban diasporas here in the United States?
Do you think that there is a what?
Cubanization, yes, and like a mingling of ideologies of like the way to talk.
You mean that they are affine?
Yes.
Yeah,
Affine.
they are. I mean, they have lived through a lot of the same, they come from similar social classes. You know, their histories have some things in common, though Venezuelans have always been far more democratic in their practice than Cubans have ever been. So, but they found each other, so to speak, here in Miami.
And I think that's a good research question. I think there hasn't been enough work done on Venezuelans, for example, in Miami, and even in comparison with Cuban. But I want to say one thing about that is that, of course, the reception of both diasporas, Cubans and Venezuelans, has been very different, right? And even today, as you know, most Venezuelans are not accepted as political refugees, right? And they have temporary status, which Cubans have not had to go through. There is no Venezuelan privilege adjustment. No one is. No, but point to
Another time.
the existence of the Cuban Adjustment Act, right? I mentioned in my presentation, there's no such thing, no path for Venezuelans to become U.S. citizens after one year and 1 day. So I think that makes for an interesting comparison, similar perhaps backgrounds, similar motivations,
Although they-
similarly complicated relationship with the homeland, right?
Yeah, although the new Biden humanitarian parole does put Cubans, Venezuelans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans.
But separately from the Cuban Adjustment Act, it's not the same.
No,
kind
I
of
know,
thing.
but I'm saying that they
And
put
it's temporary.
all of them together.
I know, but I mean, there still is a different,
Oh, no,
when I
yeah.
say
well,
privilege,
well,
there's a different legal treatment of Cubans
yeah.
compared to any other, including Venezuela.
But that goes back to the fact that the Cuban Adjustment Act took place in 65, 66 at a moment of the height of the
During
Cold
the Cold
War.
War. Right.
And also the fiasco of Bay of Pigs,
Right.
which the United States was partly responsible for.
But what's interesting is that despite the
And now
similarities that both of you have talked
to
about.
ask Congress to undo that.
Yeah.
In the first place, Congress doesn't come together for anything having to do with immigration and doing
Yeah.
away with an act.
Yeah, but my final point there would be that despite the similarities in the two revolutions, the United States has treated Venezuela and Cuba very differently, which I think. is-
I mean, I would add that you know, if you look at Washington, there's far greater Cuban diaspora representation than there is Venezuelan diaspora representation. Although the Cuban diaspora representation is largely sort of bringing in the Venezuelan experience to continue to make their case in Congress, but the reality is they're Cuban, right? Diaspora representatives, and so while Venezuelans have maybe made that space in the state legislature, maybe a little bit more than sort of federal, but I would say that again, the political representation in our, you know, both state and federal, you know, house and you know, houses are different, and that may lead to sort of the different in which you talk about, Jorge, the difference in privilege.
Yeah, okay.
Well, the only thing that I would say about that is that Cuban American representation, which I think is a great success in Congress, didn't happen overnight. You know, that took almost like a full generation before that happened. And Venezuelans haven't been here that long.
Yeah.
But I would expect Venezuelans to actually follow exactly on the footsteps of Cubans.
And also another difference is that most Venezuelans are not US citizens. so they
Yeah,
can't
that's
vote.
why, that's why,
Oh, yeah.
because it's the second generation that
Yeah.
becomes.
Better.
Thank you. First of all, thanks for the book. I took with the media to my own theory, the kind of comparativity to it.
Yeah.
But I have a question, or have questions about Venezuela case. So, what is the current situation of the civic society in Venezuela? Well,
The civic society.
right. Sorry.
Well, I think honestly, a lot of respect has to be paid. We have to pay due to the Venezuelan civil society. It has been very, very resilient under so much repression. There are still many human rights organizations, many independent groups working in the country. However, in recent years, we have seen a progressive criminalization of activities of non-governmental organizations, foundations. Just in January of this year, a new act was passed establishing very severe penalties for organizations that do not meet very specific funding criteria. So any international organization, any international funding is strictly prohibited. Engaging in political activities, and the law does not define what a political activity is also sanctioned by that law. And the penalties for it even include dissolution of the organization by the state. So we do see that those channels for political dissent have been formally closing. I have many colleagues in the country who have had to flee or have been outright detained just because of the exercise of advocacy in the name of victims, or even research for that matter. We're publishing these statistics that the government definitely does not want to be out there. So I do think that there is great work being done by organizations of the civil society, but unfortunately it's in a context that is criminalizing their activities more and more every day.
Yeah, I want to ask you about a point that is mentioned in the description of your book and you didn't have time to talk about, is the trade-off or the connections between Cuba and Venezuela under Chavez. And you mentioned, I think, oil for doctors. Can you say something more?
Oh,
about
yeah.
that?
Well, that's where I began working on this book, because I had always been working on immigrants. And I thought of all the immigrants that I have studied and so on, I want to study the doctors that went overseas and started working as doctors in different countries. And indeed, I began with interviews with people who had worked on medical missions, international missions, as they're called, in Guatemala, in the Seychelles Islands, in Cape Verde. And I was collecting my interviews, and then I arrived at the Venezuelan interviews, and I began listening and realizing that they were completely different, because there was a political aspect to those experiences that was not present in the others. When I had interviewed people who had worked in medical missions in Guatemala, in the Seychelles Islands and so on, they talked about the humanitarian aspect. The medical mission itself was small, somewhere between 50 doctors and maybe at the most 150 doctors if there was a terremoto, a hurricane. And while in the case of the thousands of people that left Cuba and worked in Venezuela, most of the time it was up to 20,000 health personnel, is what Carlos and I decided to call them, because it was doctors, ophthalmologists, nurses, everybody, sports medicine, everybody involved in the health aspects. So the very numbers were completely different. But I think that the thing that made me realize that I had to go in a different direction, and the direction became the book that compared Cuba and Venezuela. I have interviews with about 30 doctors that worked in Venezuela that became a part of this book. And the reason that what really cemented my shift to a different sort of a project was one woman that I interviewed who was an ophthalmologist. So she was in Venezuela, and it was her second international mission. Her first one had been in Guatemala. So she had gone on a medical mission and gone back to Cuba. People just earned better salaries and so on. And they could return to Cuba with what Cubans call electrodomésticos, with refrigerators and televisions. So it was always an advantage to be a doctor and work for a couple of years somewhere else and then return to Cuba. Even though you had to go by yourself, you couldn't take a spouse, you couldn't take a child, you were very much alone. And you were also very much watched. There were people in the dorms that they lived in that kept their passports and so on. So that, they were always under surveillance also. But the big thing that got to her, because until then she has thought of herself as a revolucionario, and the thing that got to her was when she was a surgeon for eye operations. And normally when you, in Venezuela, there's a lot of people who have what is called terrigio, which begins with the P. The P is silent, terrigio, because they cook with leña, and the smoke gets in their eyes. And so it becomes like a cataract where you can't see clearly, So when you are an ophthalmologist, you remove, with a surgical instrument, you remove that cataract-like thing. And so the first thing that people say when they suddenly see us, they say, "Thanks be to God." And then she said, and I was supposed to say, "And to Chavez." And that was what really made me realize that there was a political context that those doctors were living in that was different than any of the other interviews that I had heard about. And then I went into this project. Thank you for reminding me that I forgot to
Any
mention.
other questions or comments? Yes.
Elaborate on. Mr. Fonseca has
No, I just needed to say thank you so much. I'm being kicked out of the room that I'm in. And so I want to apologize for an earlier departure, but Jorge, thank you so much. And Sylvia, and I apologize I couldn't be there, but thank you so much for the opportunity. So
That's
I
great.
apologize.
Yeah, thanks
Yeah.
for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Okay.
Thank you.
You have her?
Yeah.
Hi, Brian. Why don't we go to her because she hasn't.
Sure.
Oh, you're saying bye. Okay. You're not.
I just wanted to even mention more the political ideology process. For example, the diaspora, the Venezuelan diaspora in Argentina is somewhat different, at least politically, than the one. And I wanted to ask if you think that there's a Cuban influence to that shift in ideology.
Who shifted from where to what?
Like, there is a difference between, for example, Venezuela or Venezuela Peru to the one.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay. I think always, because I'm a sociologist, that people live in a certain social context and that they shape their choices that they make according to the social context that explains to them what they're living in. And I think that the social context in Argentina is, and I would include there, by the way, Pope Francis, that has become very obvious to me. And when he went to Cuba, when he went to the United States and so on, that he understands fascism very well, dictatorships of the right, but he does not know anything about dictatorships of the left. It was clear when he came to Cuba that he did not know what he was in the presence of. So I think that, yes, that people's attitudes are shaped by the context.
And again, I would say that we need more study. I haven't seen
Yeah.
myself studies of different
That's true.
Venezuelan diaspora communities. There's much more on the Cuban diaspora because it's longer and there have been more people studying it. But when did you say the large scale 2015?
2015 marks the beginning of that
It's
massive.
only been a few
yeah.
years. I think I have seen studies of Venezuelan in Spain and here in the US, but Argentina, Panama, Peru, Colombia, I mean, there are so many countries now that have large Venezuelan communities. There needs to be more field work and more research on it so that we can compare them.
How do they compare in the US, the Cuban diaspora and the Venezuelan diaspora here?
But again, I don't think we have much information except the census.
The census doesn't tell you anything about
Yeah.
attitudes.
But the roles of those two diasporas here, how do they compare?
We don't even know, for example, how the Venezuelans vote in the last election. We know how Cuban voted for the Republican Party. And for
Well,
Trump. Venezuelans, there is no good data.
Yeah.
There is a little survey that is, we incorporated into the book. Eduardo, somebody spoke of it. And what he basically said was that Venezuelans alone could not shape, political outcomes in the United States, but together with Cubans, Nicaraguans, other folks, they could constitute a sort of conservative pole in Florida. And I think that that's probably as good as it's gonna get.
Okay, so thank you very much for joining us.
Thank
We
you.
invite you, those who have no plans for tonight, Professor Pedraza will be presenting her book, books and books, and everyone is welcome to come, and maybe you can get your book signed, so. thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Muy bueno. Bueno, pero ya,